We're going to hear about the rights of the child now, and this is really interesting how our current homelessness system is breaking the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so I'd like to welcome up Rachel Fox to take us through this at a gallop of a pace.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me to speak today. I'll try and do a gallop of a pace best I can. So I'm Rachel Fox, I'm from UNICEF UK, and today I'm probably going to be a slightly different gear to some of the others in that I'm talking more at the level of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I want to give an overview of that convention, outline the relevance to families facing homelessness and living in temporary accommodation, and also talk about some of the ways in which you might use the UN Convention to drive positive changes for children. So turning to the next slide. So UNICEF globally is mandated by the UN General Assembly to promote and protect child rights around the world. And actually the Article 45 in the Convention gives UNICEF a role in providing technical assistance and advice to states on implementing that convention. And as a national committee of UNICEF UK, of which I'm part, their work is guided by the UN Convention, and it's a core strand of our work to influence embedding that into domestic policies and legislation. And that's the area part that I personally lead on. We also have thematic policy work focusing on early childhood, and much of that has focused on the needs of children around health, early education, and also poverty, and we've had a lot of focus recently on removing the 2-child limit and benefit cap. And I think it's really clear that having a safe and secure and stable housing situation is vital for protecting the full range of children's rights. UNICEF UK also reaches children in the UK through our Baby Friendly initiative, Rights Respecting Schools programme, and as part of work with cities and communities, we've done child-friendly based approaches to housing, training with local authorities. So just turning to the next slide. So this may be quite familiar to some of you, but I thought it'd be helpful to run through just kind of some of the nuts and bolts of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's the most widely ratified international human rights treaty, so more states around the world than any other treaty have ratified it. The UK agreed to follow it in 1991, so as a matter of international law, it said that it would follow all the rights set out in the Convention for children. It has a broad range of rights, which covers kind of every part of life for children. So we have civil and political rights, such as freedom of religion, the right to life, for example, and we also have what are called civil, economic, social, and cultural rights. So that includes things like the right to the best possible health, to education, and also adequate living standards, which covers the right to adequate housing, which I'll say a bit more about later. And the Convention also contains what we call 4 general principles, which underpin all the rights in the Convention and are rights in themselves. So that's non-discrimination, the best interests of a child, the right to life, survival, and development, and the right of a child to be heard and to have their views respected. So those are kind of running through the whole Convention. And while the treaty is kind of binding in international law, it's not actually been incorporated into the law across the whole of the UK. So that means that the main, and I'll say more on that later, but the main accountability mechanism we have really is regular monitoring by an expert international committee called the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So around every 5 years, they review every state that has committed to this convention, and they give conclusions and recommendations. And the last review of the UK concluded in 2023. You may be aware of the recommendations, and I can just run through a few relevant ones later. And I think just as well, it's important, I think, to realise that the rights should be seen as what's called indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. And I think situations of, housing insecurity are a really clear example of how the different articles need to be reviewed holistically and how they all interconnect together. And so, turning to the next slide. So I think of really essential importance when considering the situation of temporary housing and homelessness is the right to adequate living standards, and as part of that we have the right to adequate housing. So Article 27 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about the right of every child to a standard of living that's adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, and moral development. And that explicitly recognises that where parents can't provide the necessary support, states must provide material assistance and support, and that includes in relation to housing. And other treaties recognise this right, so the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is a really key one, and there are other conventions that also recognise it. And just some kind of more nuts and bolts that I think it's helpful to understand, which is that in relation to all the economic and social and cultural rights, so that includes the right to housing, states should protect, respect and fulfil those rights. So respect means they shouldn't interfere directly with the right, so states shouldn't evict people from houses. As just one example, states should also protect rights infringements from third parties. So for example, there should be laws, policies, regulatory frameworks in place to make sure that landlords, property developers, for example, can't evict people, can't have conditions of housing which are negative for people. And I think some of the law changes recently, such as our law and the Rentals Rights Act, is the kind of thing where you see that those kind of protect elements can be put in place. And fulfilling means, putting in place all the necessary measures to realise the rights fully. So there should be policies and practices, there should be relevant laws and policies. Disadvantaged and marginalised groups should be particularly considered. And states are also required to progressively realise these rights. And you might hear the term progressively realise in accordance with their available resources. And I think sometimes when you hear progressive realisation talked about, it's sometimes talked about as being quite a loose framework where states don't really have to do anything in particular, and they can kind of just make slow progress at their own pace. But if you actually look to the kind of international frameworks around this, progressive realisation is quite a clear and rigorous framework. So states must be taking steps immediately and on an ongoing basis to move further towards realising all the rights. They must use their maximum available resources. And again, if you look at the frameworks, there are specific requirements around using resources efficiently, prioritising resources, looking at where states might be spending a lot on programmes which aren't benefiting people's rights, where they could be spending that money. And also a really, really strong presumption against taking backward steps. So states should be moving towards fulfilling rights and not taking rights away from people. And when it comes to adequate housing, the UN committee that oversees the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights sets out a framework of 7 principles of what we mean by adequacy of housing. And I won't run through all in detail, but I think some that I'll mention are availability of key services that ensure health and security, such as safe drinking water, cooking, energy for cooking, heating and lighting, sanitation and washing facilities, affordability, so the costs of housing shouldn't be so high that people can't meet other needs that they have. Habitability, which is obviously really key for temporary accommodation and any form of housing, but making sure that there's adequate space, people are protected from cold, damp, heat, rain, any other kind of threats to health. Legal security of tenure, so people have security in the home they're living in. And also cultural adequacy, so different needs that people may have, given their different backgrounds, should be considered as well. So yeah, just turning to the next slide. So this is just an illustration of some of the rights that kind of interlink, so demonstrating kind of how interrelated and interdependent the rights are. And there are many other rights could be listed here, but just to kind of list a few, we've obviously got Article 27, the right to adequate standard of living, which includes adequate housing. And when we look at the situation of children and families facing homelessness, you'll also see the relevance of the right to education, with children potentially having to travel further to school or not having a space to do their homework. The right to social security, which is obviously engaged, where people's social security benefits might be lessened, making housing less affordable for them. The right to play. If children don't have enough room to play, they don't have access to playgrounds, that clearly would impact that right if they're placed somewhere where they don't have access. And also, of course, the right to the best possible health. So when we have conditions in housing which threaten health, that's clearly negatively affected. So that's just really to demonstrate that, these rights all interplay and they're all really important to consider when we look at this issue. So yeah, just going to the next slide. Yeah, so sorry, it's a bit of a busy slide, but I've tried to use boldening to help. But this is just some of the recommendations that have come out in recent years from UN committees. So the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2023 made a number of recommendations on what the UK should do to address the adequate living standards for children, and that included addressing the root causes of homelessness, strengthening measures around temporary accommodation and other measures, as well as ending child poverty. So that they made some key recommendations there. And then more recently, which was just earlier this year, and this is a review that UNICEF UK was involved in, was the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights made recommendations, some of which repeat the same recommendations as the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, but it included, ensuring availability of affordable housing, and addressing, again, the root causes of homelessness and the issues around temporary accommodation. So I think if you're not aware of these recommendations, I can always share links to where you can find them. And I think, just going to the next slide. So one thing that we know, I noted earlier in the UK, is that the UN Convention has been committed to as a matter of international law, but it's not actually been embedded into law across the UK, which means that a child or families can't actually go to court to enforce these rights, unfortunately. It is varied across the UK, so Scotland has incorporated the convention directly into law. So that means that children there, so public authorities in Scotland have a duty not to act incompatibly with the rights in the convention, and children can go to court to enforce those rights if they think local authorities are acting, public authorities are acting incompatibly. And in Wales, there's also a duty to a due regard duty on ministers to consider children's rights. And apologies, that should say in Wales and Jersey. I will change that. Not in Northern Ireland. In Wales and Jersey, there are duties to consider children's rights and give due regard to them. And also, in certain circumstances, child rights impact assessments should be carried out on laws and policies. But by contrast, the UK government, in respect of England and reserved matters across the UK, is really lagging behind. And also Northern Ireland is also lagging behind. Apologies for that error in the slide there. So in terms of opportunities for influence, particularly around UN incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill currently going through the UK Parliament, which many of you might be aware of because there are specific, steps to try and move forward issues around temporary accommodation. That is also a potential vehicle to drive forward stronger child rights duties in England. So UNICEF UK has been working with the NSPCC and the Children's Rights Alliance for England to call for amendments to that bill that would bring in a mandatory child rights impact assessment duty on ministers. And I think, for anyone's work, whether local or national level, use it kind of drawing attention to the UN Convention and the rights of a child can be really, really important, and it can be important for parliamentarians to use it in their scrutiny of government action as well. And as part of that, kind of calling for all laws and policies to really look to those UN Convention standards and embed them, and to also follow the UN committee recommendations. So that was everything I wanted to cover. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
So it's a really strong, isn't it, framework for children. And can you imagine if we actually adopted the right to play? I mean, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it, for kids? It's definitely something that I don't routinely ask about in my day-to-day work. How have they got space to play? But can you imagine if we decided to do that? It would be incredible, wouldn't it?